I've always believed life has a way of testing us in ways we never expect. And at 70 years old, I thought I had seen nearly everything. I lost my husband 3 months ago, and even now, the mornings feel heavier than they should. My small apartment in Portland feels quieter than ever, and sometimes I catch myself staring out the window, wondering if the world outside is moving faster than I am. That's when my son, David, suggested a trip to Italy. At first, it seemed like the kind of gesture a caring son would make. He and his wife, Lisa, insisted it would be good for me to change the scenery, to rest, to rediscover life beyond grief. I remember feeling hesitant, looking around the living room where my husband and I shared our quiet mornings, thinking maybe I wasn't ready to leave it all behind. But their smiles were so practiced, so convincing, and grief has a way of making even the artificial seem kind. The idea of a family trip to Florence sounded almost perfect. I told myself I could handle it, that maybe a week among the art, the light, and the streets I'd only seen in postcards could offer something I hadn't felt in months. Arriving at the hotel, I watched David handle the check-in with a flourish that made me uneasy, without me even realizing why. Lisa nodded enthusiastically, adding just enough pressure to make the arrangement seem inevitable. The concierge greeted me with words that seemed almost too polite, the kind that carries a hint of pity for elderly women whose children handle all the details. I remember the chill that settled in my stomach when I realized the room David had chosen for me wasn't what I had expected. Isolation, silence, a courtyard instead of the Tuscan hills. It was supposed to be thoughtful. I was told, perfect for resting. Yet every instinct in my body whispered caution. Dinner that night felt like a stage. David spoke with the charm I remembered from childhood, masking something beneath the surface. Lisa cut her words with precision, agreeing with everything as if she had been rehearsing the scene. I could feel the tension before it fully revealed itself, that quiet sense that things were not as they seemed. I replayed memories of my son, the little boy who used to run to me for comfort, who had always seemed so trustworthy. It was hard to reconcile him with the man I was seeing now. As I lay in that supposedly peaceful room, listening to the silence, I could hear their voices faintly through the walls. Something about the way they spoke, about the mention of papers and appointments, made my heart tighten. I had learned to listen to the subtleties of their conversations during my life, and now that skill had a purpose I had never imagined. A sense of dread mixed with disbelief as I realized this trip might not be about family or healing at all. And then my phone buzzed. A message from someone unknown, brief and chilling to leave quietly and not to trust them. I remember staring at that screen, the room spinning around me, and feeling a strange clarity in my fear. I knew something had shifted. Life as I understood it had been rearranged in a single trip, and I had to figure out my next step before it was too late. I want you to think about the moments when the people you trust most start acting in ways that don't make sense. Have you ever had that gut feeling, that tiny whisper that something is off, and yet you can't quite prove it? That's where I was, and that's where this story begins on a beautiful September evening in Florence, standing in a hotel that felt more like a trap than a refuge. Even now, I can feel the weight of that moment. It's strange how fear and determination can exist side by side, how grief can sharpen instincts you didn't know you had. Little did I know that the days ahead would test every ounce of that instinct, and that the journey I was about to take would change not just my understanding of my son, but of myself. From that first text, from that first moment in the quiet room, I made a promise to myself I would not be fooled, I would not be silenced, and I would not give up what was mine to anyone. And so, I began paying attention in ways I never had before, watching, listening, and preparing for what came next. The streets of Florence outside my window shimmered in the fading light, beautiful and dangerous at the same time. And I realized I had to move carefully. Every detail mattered. Every gesture, every word from David and Lisa could be a clue or a trap. I could feel the tension building, a slow burn that promised the storm ahead. And as I drifted into a restless sleep, the message on my phone remained in my mind, leave quietly. Trust no one. It was the first twist in a story I never asked to be a part of, and it was only the beginning. The next morning, I woke with a knot in my stomach that refused to loosen. The room still felt quiet, too quiet, and I found myself scanning every corner, every detail, looking for signs that might explain why something felt so wrong. The small things caught my eye first. My suitcase zipper wasn't where I had left it. My purse had been moved slightly, and my toiletries were arranged differently. I realized someone had been in my room while I slept. Memories flooded back from years of noticing subtle cues in my household. The way my husband and I read each other's moods. The way I had always sensed when my son was hiding something. I recalled the tiny betrayals and little secrets from his childhood, and a chill ran down my spine. The trip that had been presented as a chance for family togetherness now felt like a stage carefully constructed around me. As I replayed their words and gestures, I remembered David mentioning Italian investments that my husband supposedly had. Investments I had never heard of? Something about it didn't add up. I knew every account, every policy, every small investment we had made together over decades. These claims sounded rehearsed, too precise, too confident. Lisa's sudden fluency in financial regulations seemed rehearsed as well, almost suspicious. I lay awake that night, heart pounding, listening through the thin walls, straining to catch fragments of their conversation. Even muffled, their words told me enough they were talking about paperwork I wouldn't understand, forms I was expected to sign without question. The realization settled in slowly, horrifyingly. This trip wasn't about comforting a grieving mother. It was about controlling her. It was about turning grief into vulnerability and using it to take what they believed they deserved. A message appeared on my phone, urgent and anonymous, warning me to leave quietly and trust no one. My hands shook as I read it, the words echoing in my mind. My instincts, honed by decades of living and grieving, confirmed what I had begun to suspect. The people I loved, the ones I thought I could trust the most, were planning to manipulate me, to take advantage of my sorrow. I thought back to all the times David had acted like the perfect son, how Lisa had aligned herself with him, always so helpful, so concerned. Every compliment, every gentle insistence, every suggestion that I needed to rest suddenly felt like part of a rehearsed performance. The kindness that had once felt reassuring now seemed calculated, a carefully crafted way to disarm me, to make me compliant. I realized then that I had to act, that hesitation could cost me everything I had built, everything my husband and I had worked for all those years. My mind raced as I remembered every lesson I had learned managing a household, negotiating life, and protecting those I loved. This wasn't just about money, it was about autonomy, dignity, and survival. I resolved to pay attention to every detail, to question every explanation, and to prepare for the next steps. I thought about how I had guided David through childhood, how I had seen him grow, and I tried to reconcile the boy I had known with the man who now posed a threat to my security. The contrast was jarring and painful, yet it strengthened my resolve. In that quiet Florence night, with the city lights glowing faintly through my window, I made a promise to myself I would not allow manipulation or deceit to define this chapter of my life. I would watch, I would listen, and I would act when the time came. I didn't yet know how, but I knew that I had to trust my instincts above all else. Have you ever had a moment when someone you loved seemed suddenly unrecognizable, when every gesture, every word, felt layered with hidden intent? That's where I found myself, standing alone in a foreign city, confronted with the betrayal I never thought I would face, and preparing for a choice that would define my next steps. As I drifted into an uneasy sleep, I knew the real challenge was only beginning, and the days ahead would test every ounce of clarity and courage I had left. The next morning, my phone buzzed again, and this time the message was more detailed, more urgent. Someone I didn't know, but who clearly understood the situation, warned me that the appointment David and Lisa had planned was a trap. They wanted me to sign documents that would hand over control of everything my husband and I had built. I felt a cold wave of disbelief and fear, but beneath it, something else stirred determination. I remembered the lessons life had given me, the countless times I had managed our household, guided our finances, and navigated challenges without losing my composure. I thought of the mornings with my husband, the quiet strength he had encouraged me to carry, and I realized that I could still fight for myself. Grief had made me vulnerable, but it had not made me powerless. I reflected on every interaction with David and Lisa over the past few days, their smiles, their reassurances, their insistence that everything was for my benefit now seemed rehearsed, a way to make me doubt my instincts. My heart ached thinking about the boy David had once been, the son I had loved without question. It was hard to reconcile that image with the man orchestrating this betrayal. I knew I couldn't confront them directly, yet not without planning. Every instinct told me that rushing in could ruin my only chance to protect myself. I thought about the privacy of my hotel room, the layout of the gardens, the streets of Florence outside my window. I began mapping a plan in my mind, careful and deliberate. Every detail mattered: how to move without drawing attention, where to go for help, and how to ensure I remained in control. There was a strange clarity in the fear I felt. I realized that vulnerability could be a tool if approached wisely. I reminded myself that I had survived losses before, that I had handled challenges far more ordinary, but still difficult. Now, the stakes were higher, and the strategy required more attention, more care. I thought about Elena, my husband's old business partner, the one who had sent messages to warn me. Trusting someone unknown felt risky, yet I had no choice. I had to weigh that trust against the deceit I had already recognized in my own family. My mind replayed years of grief and resilience, all the quiet strength I had built within myself. I could act, but I had to act carefully. In that hotel room, I made a decision that felt both terrifying and empowering. I would not go to the appointment. I would not allow manipulation to define my actions. Instead, I would gather allies, secure professional guidance, and move deliberately. I would turn the very skills David and Lisa had underestimated: my knowledge, my experience, my patience against their scheme. As I prepared to leave my room the next morning, I could feel my heart steadying. The city outside was alive, full of light and movement, but I felt a different kind of focus within me. I wasn't just reacting anymore. I was choosing, planning, and reclaiming agency. The next steps were uncertain, but for the first time in days, I felt a flicker of control. Have you ever faced a moment when you realized that someone you trusted could harm you? When your instincts screamed that the path laid out for you was a trap? That is when I learned that fear could become strategy, and that the quiet voice inside could be more powerful than any imposed plan. The next day, I found myself walking through the hotel gardens, pretending to enjoy the morning air, while every step was measured, every glance cautious. I thought about how David and Lisa had underestimated me, how they assumed grief had dulled my instincts. But grief had not broken me. It had sharpened me, made me notice every subtle shift, every practiced smile, every calculated gesture. I recalled the warnings from Elena, the careful guidance that felt almost like a lifeline in a city where I knew no one. She reminded me to trust no one except those whose advice came from experience, not obligation. And then there was the American consulate, a place that had always felt formal and distant. But suddenly, it became my refuge, a sanctuary where I could find clarity and guidance. I reflected on the countless moments in my life where patience and observation had been my tools. Managing a household for decades, negotiating day-to-day challenges, handling finances and family matters, these were not small accomplishments. They were lessons that now became my armor. I reminded myself that experience is a form of strength, and I was about to wield it with precision. Sitting across from the consular officer, Patricia, I felt a wave of relief mixed with determination. She listened as I recounted the subtle signs of manipulation, the documents I had been asked to sign, the quiet isolation of my hotel room, the suspicious behavior of my son and daughter-in-law. In her calm, measured responses, I recognized the possibility of turning the situation around. I realized that every detail David and Lisa had counted on their rehearsed concern. Their orchestrated worry could become the very evidence that would expose them. My mind replayed the events of the past few days, the late-night whispers through thin walls, the unexplained references to Italian investments, the constant insistence that I was confused or vulnerable. Each memory was like a thread, and I began weaving them together into a story I could present, a narrative that could reveal the truth without me being directly confrontational. With the guidance of Patricia and the promise of legal support from my lawyer back home, I began to see the outlines of a plan. I thought about how David had manipulated situations before his questions about finances, his concern over minor missteps, and how Lisa had reinforced every act with seeming sympathy. I realized their own meticulous planning had left traces, evidence of premeditation that could be documented and used to protect me. I remembered the quiet resolve that had carried me through the weeks after my husband's passing. Every appointment, every task I had undertaken alone, had strengthened my independence, and now that strength was crucial. I began imagining the confrontation at the consulate and the legal strategy we would employ, the way truth and evidence could outmaneuver deceit. It was almost thrilling, though the stakes were frightening. Later, when David and Lisa arrived at the consulate, the sight of their practiced concern made my stomach twist. But I reminded myself to stay composed. Their efforts to appear loving and worried were transparent to me now, and I could see the cracks in their performance. I thought about how often people who plan intricate manipulations forget that their behavior leaves traces. And I felt a quiet satisfaction, knowing I had noticed everyone. As the discussion unfolded, I realized that I was not the same woman who had arrived in Florence 3 days earlier. The fear and vulnerability I had carried were still present, but they were tempered by a growing confidence. I could challenge their narrative calmly, methodically, and effectively. I felt the tension rise, but also the power of preparation, knowledge, and patience. By the end of the day, it became clear that the legal confrontation was not just about protecting my inheritance. It was about reclaiming my dignity, asserting my competence, and proving that grief and age do not equate to weakness. I thought about the lessons of resilience I had taught myself and realized that standing firm, armed with truth and careful observation, was the most empowering act I could take. As I left the consulate that evening, I felt a cautious optimism. The next steps were still uncertain, but for the first time, I believed that justice, carefully pursued, could prevail. I had survived grief, manipulation, and betrayal. And now, I was ready to face the final reckoning. Have you ever found yourself in a situation where your strength and patience were the only tools that could save you? That is the moment I recognized that experience and careful attention could become my most potent allies, and that even in betrayal, clarity could emerge. By the time the legal battle was over, I felt a mixture of exhaustion and relief, unlike anything I had experienced in years. David and Lisa's petitions had been denied, and they were now facing serious consequences for their actions. Standing outside the courtroom, I could feel the weight of months of fear and suspicion lifting, replaced by a quiet, steady pride. I thought about the woman I had been when I first arrived in Florence, vulnerable, grieving, trusting without hesitation. That Evelyn no longer existed. I had reclaimed control over my life and my future, proving to myself that age and sorrow did not make me powerless. It was a lesson I carried deeply in my heart. Resilience is built quietly, over time, and it shows when it is most needed. Sitting alone later in my hotel room, I reflected on everything I had learned. Betrayal is painful, but it also illuminates the strength within you that you might not have recognized. I remembered the countless little moments I had underestimated myself managing finances, organizing family gatherings, caring for my husband through his illness. Each had prepared me for this moment, though I hadn't realized it at the time. I allowed myself to imagine a future that I could now shape freely. The trip that had begun as a potential trap had become a turning point, a revelation of my own capabilities. I thought about moving to Tuscany, finding a place to call my own, and living the life I had envisioned with my husband not as a couple, sadly, but as an independent woman empowered by experience and wisdom. I also reflected on the importance of boundaries and self-respect. Trust is a fragile thing, and even those closest to you can betray it. But the ability to act thoughtfully, to protect oneself while remaining grounded in integrity, is invaluable. I felt a deep gratitude for the guidance I had received from Elena and the consulate, for the legal counsel that enabled me to confront deceit without losing my dignity. The experience left me both cautious and hopeful. I knew that I could navigate life's challenges with renewed confidence, that even when faced with manipulation and betrayal, I could rely on my judgment and my instincts. I also recognized the value of sharing these experiences, not for vindication, but to remind others that resilience and self-trust are powerful tools in a world that does not always act fairly. As I stood on the terrace of my new apartment, looking out over rolling hills dotted with olive trees and vineyards, I felt a quiet joy that was entirely my own. Life could still offer beauty, peace, and purpose, even after betrayal and grief. I had survived, grown stronger, and reclaimed the life I deserved. Have you ever faced a moment when you realized that standing up for yourself was the only way to protect what truly mattered? I hope this story reminds you that even in the darkest moments, courage and clarity can guide you. And if you've ever felt this kind of struggle, I invite you to share your thoughts, experiences, and reflections in the comments below, because our stories matter and they help each of us grow stronger. Sitting on the terrace of my new apartment in Tuscany, I felt a peace I hadn't known in years. The hills and vineyards stretched before me, and for the first time since losing my husband, I felt fully alive in my own story. I had survived betrayal, reclaimed my independence, and learned the value of trusting my instincts above all else. Life after grief and deception is still full of beauty and purpose. If you allow yourself to claim it, I hope my story inspires you to stand firm, trust yourself, and never underestimate your own strength. Share your experiences, comment, and let your voice be heard.